When 81-year-old Dolores Jordan made a quiet phone call to her son, six-time NBA champion and global icon Michael Jordan, she didn't expect it to change anything beyond her small North Carolina town. All she wanted was his advice on how to save a local community center where she used to read books to neighborhood children. But what Michael did next? It went far beyond advice. It shook an entire city awake, reignited forgotten dreams, and reminded the world that some of the greatest victories don't happen on a basketball court. It all started with a quiet voice on the other end of the line. The morning sun cast a warm glow over the Carolina pines outside Michael Jordan's mansion in Jupiter, Florida. Inside, the basketball legend stood at his kitchen counter, absently stirring cream into his coffee. His days were quieter now. No roaring crowds, no courtside pressure. Just golf rounds, business meetings, and the occasional deep reflection. His phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a familiar name. Mom. Michael smiled. Dolores didn't call often. She was old school like that, believing in handwritten letters, face-to-face conversations, and the kind of silence that spoke volumes. When she did call, it usually meant something. "Hey, Mama," Michael said, answering with that boyish tone he always reserved for her. "Hi, sweetheart," came her gentle reply, soft but clear. There was a pause, one Michael immediately picked up on. His mother never rushed into things. She chose her words carefully, like stitching fabric into meaning. And today, her tone held a weight he hadn't heard in a long time. "Everything okay?" he asked, setting his coffee down. "Well," Dolores exhaled, and even over the phone, Michael could hear the hesitation in her breath. "There's something I've been thinking about. Something I wasn't sure I should bring to you." Michael leaned against the counter, his full attention now locked in. "Mama, you know you can tell me anything." Another pause, then quietly, "It's the old Wilmington Library, the one they turned into the youth center back in the 90s. Remember it?" Of course he remembered. That red brick building on the corner of 7th Street. It had once been their sanctuary, an after-school escape filled with dog-eared books and the scent of worn-out pages. Dolores used to volunteer there when Michael was a boy, reading to kids whose parents worked double shifts or weren't around at all. It was where she had taught him the power of words, the magic of learning. "I remember," Michael said, voice softer now. "They're closing it, Michael," Dolores said, the heartbreak in her voice barely hidden. "Funding's been cut for years, and they finally gave up. Said there's not enough use, not enough value." She let out a short breath. "But I still go, you know, on Wednesdays. Just a few kids these days, maybe 6 or 7. But they listen. They need it." Michael was quiet. Not because he didn't care, because he cared too much. He could feel the memories rushing in like floodwater. That building was more than bricks. It was where he'd sat cross-legged on cold floors, listening to his mother read Charlotte's Web like it was gospel. It was where he'd felt seen, long before the cameras, the trophies, or the billion-dollar brand. "I didn't call to ask for money," Dolores added quickly, almost defensively. I don't know. I thought maybe you'd have some ideas. Maybe there's someone you know who could help." Michael's throat tightened. That was just like her, never wanting to be a burden. Even after all these years, even after everything he'd accomplished, Dolores Jordan still approached her son with humility. She wasn't asking for help to save a building. She was asking to save a space where hope had once lived. He walked to the window, staring out at the manicured lawn. His mind was already moving, calculating, imagining, remembering. He saw himself at 10 years old, holding a tattered library card like it was a golden ticket. He saw his mother, sitting in that same corner chair, reading with warmth and purpose, to kids who had nothing but stories to carry them away. "You didn't need to ask, Mama," he finally said. "This place means something, not just to me, to a whole lot of kids who still need it, even if they don't know it yet." There was a pause, then a soft chuckle from Dolores. "You always did have a way of making things sound possible." Michael smiled, but there was something different behind his eyes now. Determination, purpose, the same fire that had driven him on the court. Except this time, it wasn't about winning games. "I'll take care of it," he said. "But not just a patch-up job. I'm going to build something better, bigger, and it's going to carry your name, Mama, because you've been doing the real work for years, and no one noticed." Dolores tried to protest, but Michael wouldn't let her. Not this time. He ended the call with a promise, a quiet one, spoken from the heart of a son who knew exactly what he owed. And as he stood there, alone in his kitchen, Michael Jordan wasn't thinking about legacy in terms of championships or shoe deals. He was thinking about a crumbling library in Wilmington, and a woman with a gentle voice who had once read to him by lamplight. He picked up his phone again, not to call, but to act. Because when your mother asks for help, and her name is Dolores Jordan, you don't just answer. You build something that speaks louder than words, something that leaves the world speechless. Dolores Jordan sat in her small sunroom in Wilmington, a half-finished cup of tea growing cold on the table beside her. Outside, azaleas bloomed in pinks and purples, and children's laughter echoed faintly from a nearby park. She could hear the basketballs bouncing against the pavement, familiar, comforting. But that morning, the sound only made her feel the weight of time. She had never intended to call Michael. Not about this. Not about a building most people had forgotten. She had spent her whole life being strong, carrying others, not leaning on them. Even when Michael became a household name, even when money and fame flowed through their lives like rivers through a canyon, she had never been the type to ask. When her husband James passed, she hadn't asked for comfort. She'd simply buried her grief in community work. When the neighborhood began to change, when drug activity crept closer to the blocks she used to walk freely, she didn't complain. She planted flowers, organized reading days, kept going. Quiet resistance was how she had always fought back. But now something was different. The library wasn't just closing, it was vanishing. The foundation had already started to crack. Paint peeled from the wooden doors. The once bright mural of children reading under a tree faded into near invisibility. It wasn't just neglect, it was erasure. As if the stories shared in those walls didn't matter anymore. As if the kids who still showed up, half hungry, half hopeful, weren't worth the trouble. Dolores had watched it happen bit by bit. Budget cuts, shrinking attendance, staff layoffs. She kept showing up every Wednesday at 3 p.m., reading aloud whether 3 kids came or none. Sometimes she'd bake muffins. Sometimes she'd just sit quietly with a book in her lap, hoping someone would wander in and remember the power of being seen. She didn't tell Michael these things, not all of them. He had enough on his plate. He always did. He was Michael Jordan, after all. The world still wanted pieces of him, even decades after his final game. She hated the idea of adding to that weight. But when she overheard the city's final decision, when she heard that the building would be auctioned off, turned into a multi-use commercial space, something inside her broke. She sat in her kitchen that night, staring at her phone. She picked it up 3 times before actually pressing his number. And even then, she told herself, "I'm not calling to ask for anything." But of course she was. Dolores had never been afraid of hard truths. She knew exactly what kind of world they lived in. She'd grown up in it, black, female, overlooked, underestimated. She had spent a lifetime building bridges from scraps, believing that if she could give one child the tools to believe in themselves, the world would be a better place. What she didn't say to Michael on the phone, but what she felt deep in her chest, was that this library, this little corner of the world, had saved her too. Not just him. It had been her anchor during hard years, when bills piled up, when Michael's growing fame brought unwanted attention to their family, when grief threatened to swallow her whole. The library had always been a place where her voice mattered, where stories mattered, where she could look a child in the eye and remind them, "You are more than what this world tells you." So yes, she had called him. And yes, she had asked. But not because she couldn't live without the library, because she couldn't live with herself if she didn't at least try to save it. Dolores didn't want a monument. She didn't want her name on a plaque or a wing. She wanted the building to be there, still breathing, still open, still warm. A place where a tired kid could sit in a quiet corner and find themselves in the pages of a story. She had taught Michael long ago that real greatness isn't about glory. It's about what you give back when no one is watching. And now, for the first time in her life, she was watching him. Waiting, hoping, not for money, but for that fire in his eyes. The one that always lit up when the game was on the line. Because this wasn't about basketball. This was about a building, a memory, and something she didn't want to ask for, but had to anyway. Just once. Because it mattered that much. In the heart of Wilmington, North Carolina, not far from where the Cape Fear River cuts through the city like a silver ribbon, a quiet struggle had been unfolding for years. So quiet, most people didn't see it happening. But Dolores Jordan saw it. She lived it, one day at a time. Wilmington had changed. The houses that once echoed with children's laughter were quieter now. Some had boards instead of curtains. Some had silence instead of stories. What used to be a bustling neighborhood filled with church bells, cookouts, and front porch conversations had thinned into something colder, more distant. People still waved, but less often. They still cared, but quietly. And in that quiet, things began to disappear. First, it was the small grocery store where Dolores used to buy fresh vegetables and hear about people's grandbabies. Then it was the pharmacy, the bus stop, the bakery. Piece by piece, the soul of the community had been carved out and replaced by dollar stores and chain fast food, places that sold convenience but not connection. But the library, the little red brick building on the corner, had hung on like a stubborn tree in a storm. For years, it stood as a kind of promise, a place where stories lived, where knowledge was still free, where kids could sit at creaky tables under humming lights and disappear into books about dragons, inventors, astronauts, and kings. Some of those kids had never left Wilmington, never seen anything beyond their block. But when they stepped into that library, they stepped into a bigger world. Dolores had become part of the furniture there. Every Wednesday, rain or shine, she arrived in her neatly pressed slacks and soft-colored cardigan, holding a worn leather tote with books she'd carefully selected. Sometimes she brought her own tea bags and honey in a small container, just in case someone needed warming up. She never made announcements. She didn't advertise. She just sat in the corner by the big window and waited. Some days 3 kids came, some days none. Still, she read. Still, she stayed. She knew their names. Tasha, who loved mysteries. Isaiah, who always chose books with animals. Little Mariah, who hadn't spoken much until Dolores read her a story about a girl with glasses just like hers. Sometimes the parents came too, hovering near the door, unsure if they were welcome. Dolores always smiled, always waved them in. She believed that kindness was a kind of literacy too, something you could teach, page by page, smile by smile. But the city had other plans. Budgets had grown tight, and people in faraway buildings with polished shoes and clean spreadsheets looked at the numbers and saw nothing worth saving. The center wasn't profitable. Foot traffic was down. The building needed repairs. It wasn't efficient. Dolores had sat through one of those city council meetings once, the kind with buzzwords like revitalization and economic development. She had watched them skim past the line item labeled Community Resource Center, and she had known even then that they wouldn't fight for it. Not the way she would. So, she fought quietly. She organized bake sales and book drives. She wrote letters, real ones with stamps and hope, and sent them to anyone she thought might care. Sometimes, she got a polite reply. Most times, she didn't. She even dipped into her own retirement savings to buy new chairs and paint for the children's room, hoping maybe, just maybe, someone would notice. But fewer did. The struggle wasn't loud. It didn't come with marches or headlines. It came in the form of peeling linoleum and a thermostat that no longer worked. It came in the form of kids who stopped coming, not because they didn't want to, but because their parents were working double shifts and there was no one to bring them. Dolores kept showing up anyway. She believed in showing up. She believed in staying, even when the world was leaving. And it was in that quiet, unglamorous struggle, amid empty shelves, flickering lights, and whispered stories, that something powerful was still happening. Something Michael had no idea about. Not yet. But he would. Because some struggles don't need a spotlight to matter. They just need someone to finally see them. And once he did, the game was going to change. Michael sat alone on the patio of his Florida estate, the warm evening air brushing against his skin like memory. He watched the horizon fade into shades of peach and violet, the same sky he'd stared at as a boy back in Wilmington. But tonight, it wasn't the view that held his focus. It was a single sentence that kept replaying in his head. "They're closing it, Michael." The library. To most, it was just an old building with chipped bricks and a leaky roof. But to him, and to his mother, it was something else entirely. It was the first place he had learned that strength didn't always come from muscle. That words could carry you just as far as a slam dunk. That someone like him, a skinny kid from North Carolina, could read about men who built empires and think, why not me? He could still smell the dusty carpet, still hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, still remember the way his mother's voice carried across the room when she read aloud. She made stories sound like prophecy. It wasn't just a library. It was where his future had quietly begun. Michael hadn't talked to many people about what that building meant to him. The world saw the championship banners, the iconic shoes, the highlight reels. But they didn't see the other side. The soft-spoken boy who found confidence in between the pages of library books long before he found it on the court. They didn't know about the afternoons he spent curled up in the corner chair, reading about civil rights heroes, astronauts, and ancient warriors. They didn't see how that little room made him feel like he mattered, even before the world decided he did. That's what his mother had given him. Not just shelter, not just food, not just sacrifice, but belief. She had planted it in him every time she picked up a book and said, "Let's read this one together." And even as bills piled up and struggles mounted, Dolores Jordan never missed a Wednesday at the library. Not then, not now. Michael had always admired that about her, the quiet way she showed up again and again, with no fanfare, no expectation of praise. She didn't volunteer because it looked good. She did it because she knew what it meant to feel invisible. And she was determined to make sure no child under her watch ever felt that way. So when she said, "They're closing it," he didn't hear the loss of a building. He heard the silencing of possibility. He thought of the kids still growing up in Wilmington, still walking past that weathered door every day without realizing what waited inside. And he thought of what they'd lose, not just access to books, but to belonging, to imagination, to hope. It wasn't about a library. It was about dignity. It was about giving people who had nothing a place that didn't remind them of it. And Michael knew, without a doubt, that his mother had never called him for help. Not once in his life, unless she had already exhausted every other option. That meant this mattered. More than just memories, more than nostalgia. This was a thread in the fabric of who he was. And if that thread unraveled, something inside him unraveled too. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. For so long the world had measured his greatness in numbers. Points scored, rings won, records broken. But this was something else. This was the kind of legacy that didn't get enshrined in a hall or cast in bronze. This was the kind of legacy you built when no one was looking. The next morning, he canceled 3 meetings, called in 2 favors, and asked his assistant to charter a flight to Wilmington. He didn't need to announce it. He just needed to go. Because sometimes, when your mother finally asks you for something, you don't think, you don't hesitate, you remember, and then you act. Dolores Jordan had always believed in handling things herself. It was how she'd been raised, on quiet strength and quiet sacrifice. In her generation, asking for help wasn't something you did lightly. You prayed about it, you tried harder, you found a way. And if you couldn't, you made peace with the struggle and kept your chin up anyway. That's what her mother taught her, and that's what she had taught her own children. She hadn't raised Michael to be soft. She'd raised him to be strong, focused, and driven. But more than that, she raised him to carry pride with grace, to stand on his own feet, win or lose. She remembered the exact day he came home from high school with tears in his eyes after not making the varsity team. She hadn't coddled him. Instead, she'd poured him a glass of sweet tea, sat him down, and said plainly, "Now you know how it feels. What are you going to do with it?" He had nodded slowly, wiped his face, and gone outside to practice. That was the kind of boy he was. That was the kind of man he became. So when Dolores sat on the edge of her bed the night before she called him, turning the libraries closing over and over in her mind, it wasn't the first time she'd struggled with something quietly. It was just the first time she had felt like staying quiet might cost something too big to accept. She had fought for a long time to keep that place alive. She wrote letters, baked muffins, knocked on City Hall's door with folders of testimonials and hand-drawn thank you cards from children. She hosted fundraiser dinners in church basements, even raffled off her own hand-quilted blanket once to pay for new books. And through it all, she never once asked her son. Not because she couldn't, but because she didn't want to. Michael had always been generous, unfailingly so. But Dolores never wanted to be another voice pulling at him. She had watched the world do that to him his entire life. People smiled at him with dollar signs in their eyes. They didn't see her little boy anymore. They saw a solution to their problems. And as his mother, she never wanted to be one more hand in that crowd. She had her pension. She had her savings. She was fine. And if the building was falling apart, well, she could sweep around the holes in the floor and wear an extra sweater when the heat didn't work. The stories still lived there, even if the walls sagged. The love still echoed, even if the roof leaked. But the day the final notice came, printed cold and impersonal on a letter slipped under the door, something shifted. It wasn't just a building being shut down, it was history, and heart, and hope. It was her own story being erased. And something inside her finally said, "Enough." So she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the phone. She thought of all the times she'd watched Michael from the stands. Not just the slam dunks and buzzer beaters, but the quiet moments. His hand on a teammate's back, his whispered instructions during a timeout. She had seen the weight he carried, even then. And later, when the fame swelled and the lights grew blinding, she'd watched him carry the world's expectations without flinching. She was proud of him. Not because he was rich, not because he was famous, but because even with the whole world pulling at him, he still called her every Sunday, still remembered to send flowers on her birthday, still told his children stories about growing up in a small town with a strong mother and a tight budget. He hadn't forgotten. And now, she wouldn't forget what that library meant. Not just to her, but to all the people who had walked through its doors needing more than just a book. It had taken her all night to press the button. And when she finally heard his voice, "Hey, Mama," she almost changed her mind. But something in his tone, something familiar and steady, told her she was doing the right thing. Still, she couldn't help saying, "I don't want anything, Michael. Just your advice." It was a small lie, because deep down, she did want something. She wanted him to care, not with money, not with solutions, just with the same heart he'd always had when he was a boy with scraped knees and big dreams. The heart she'd helped shape. The heart that had always known exactly when to fight. And this time, she needed him to fight for something that didn't wear a jersey or play under lights. She needed him to fight for a place where stories lived. Because sometimes, the smallest places hold the biggest pieces of who we are. Michael sat on the plane, staring out the window as the clouds drifted past like silent witnesses. His phone rested on the tray table, screen dark now after hours of silence. He hadn't called anyone else, not his assistant, not the board of his foundation, not even his kids. This wasn't about logistics or headlines. This wasn't about press releases or strategic philanthropy. This was about memory. About a basement on the south side of Wilmington that still echoed in the corners of his mind. He hadn't thought about it in years, not really. But as soon as his mother said the word library, it had all come rushing back. Not the neat public reading rooms with tall shelves and alphabetized sections. No, the first library Michael remembered wasn't even a library at all. It was the basement of the tiny house they rented when he was 6. A space so cramped and low-ceilinged he had to duck to walk through it once he started growing taller. His mother had turned that basement into a sanctuary. She'd cleared out old boxes and set up a folding table, 2 chairs, and a lamp that flickered when it rained. On the walls, she had taped up pictures cut from magazines, images of scientists, writers, athletes, kings. Next to each one, she'd written their names in neat black marker. "This is who you can be," she'd say. Every evening after dinner, she'd bring down a book. Sometimes a biography, sometimes a collection of poems. Sometimes something silly like green eggs and ham, because even greatness needed room to laugh. And she read, even when she was tired from working all day, even when the electricity bill came with red warnings and stress pressed against her temples like a headache that never left. Even when Michael protested or begged to go shoot hoops with the boys down the street. She still read. He could picture it now. Her calm voice rising above the buzz of the laundry machine. Her finger moving slowly under the words as she taught him to sound out names he'd never heard before. Sojourner Truth, Thurgood Marshall, Langston Hughes. He had no idea who they were, not yet. But the way his mother spoke their names made them sound like giants. He'd sit in that cold basement, legs swinging off the folding chair, and listen. Not just to the stories, but to the rhythm of belief. That subtle, invisible thing in her voice that told him, "You belong in these pages." Even now, as one of the most recognized names on the planet, Michael knew that belief was the foundation beneath every arena he'd walked into, every boardroom he'd sat in, every decision he'd made. He wasn't born with confidence. It had been read into him, one page at a time. He thought about the way his mother never used the word poor, even when they were. She called it tight times, and she called him rich in mind. He didn't always understand it back then, but he does now. The basement hadn't had fancy furniture or polished floors, but it had been sacred ground, a place where dreams were lit like candles and protected from the cold winds of the outside world. When the plane touched down in North Carolina, Michael stayed seated as the others gathered their bags and shuffled off. He remained still, hands resting on his knees, mind still in the basement, in that folding chair with his mother beside him. It was never just about books. It was never just about the words on the page. It was about having someone who believed you were worthy of them. He stood slowly, grabbing his bag and nodding to the flight attendant as he stepped off the jet. The Wilmington air hit him like memory, and with every step toward the waiting car, he could feel it, his past and present walking beside each other. He wasn't here to be Michael Jordan, the celebrity. He was here as the boy who used to sit in a basement listening to his mother read about kings. And now, it was time to build a castle of his own, one with open doors, bright lights, and a place for every child who still needed to know they belonged in the story. Wilmington in the late 1960s was a world of contradictions. Warm porches and cold shoulders, tight-knit neighborhoods, and invisible lines you didn't cross. For the Jordan family, it was home. Not a perfect one, not a prosperous one, but one built on love, work, and faith. And for Dolores and Michael, those early years shaped not only who they were, but how they moved through a world that wasn't always kind. Dolores had grown up understanding struggle, not the loud, headline-grabbing kind, but the quiet, grinding version that comes from making a dollar stretch to next week, or pretending you weren't tired when your kids needed you to smile. She didn't complain. Complaining was a luxury. She cooked, cleaned, worked when she could, prayed when she couldn't, and stitched purpose into every corner of their lives. Michael saw it all. Even when he was too young to fully understand what she was doing, he watched. He watched how she made a meal out of almost nothing, how she pressed his shirts just right for Sunday church, how she made sure every birthday had at least one wrapped present, even when money was tight. She didn't say things like, "We can't afford it." She said, "Let's be creative." And when James Jordan, Michael's father, came home from long shifts, tired and quiet, it was Dolores who kept the rhythm of the house steady. She was the metronome of their lives, calm, deliberate, always one step ahead of the chaos. They didn't live in a big house, but there was always room for books, always room for questions, always time to dream, so long as the dreams came after the chores were done. Michael had chores early. He swept floors, carried laundry, helped his dad in the yard. And if he complained, Dolores had one line that cut through every excuse. "Do you want to be average, or do you want to be more?" He didn't fully grasp the weight of those words until much later. At the time, he just thought it meant don't slack off. But in truth, Dolores was building something in him, layer by layer. She was teaching him that greatness was earned in the quiet moments no one saw. Not in the gym, not under the lights, but in how you held yourself, how you treated others, how you faced disappointment. And there was plenty of disappointment. The Jordans didn't have much, but they had pride. And pride sometimes clashed with reality. Michael remembered the sting of being teased at school for wearing the same pair of sneakers every day. He remembered his stomach growling during class and pretending he wasn't hungry. He remembered the embarrassment of needing help but not wanting anyone to know. But he also remembered something else. He remembered his mother holding her head high when others looked down on them. He remembered her walking into meetings where she wasn't wanted, speaking with a quiet strength that silenced the room. He remembered her looking at him after every setback, not with pity, but with expectation. She never told him to quit crying. She told him to keep going, because that's what she did. When Michael was 10, he got in a fight at school. Another boy had called his family nothing special. Michael had thrown a punch. The school called home. That night, sitting at the dinner table, he expected to be punished. Instead, Dolores had leaned in and said calmly, "Is that who you are, Michael? Someone who lets other people tell him what he's worth?" He didn't have an answer, but he never forgot the question. Years later, as the cameras flashed and his name echoed in arenas across the world, he carried those moments with him. Not the championships, not the magazine covers. The moments in that small home with peeling wallpaper and the scent of cornbread in the air. The lessons weren't shouted. They were modeled. They were lived. So when his mother called about the library, the one place in their old neighborhood still holding on to the spirit of what she had built in that little house, it wasn't just nostalgia that stirred something in him. It was memory. It was gratitude. It was knowing that everything he had become started in that humble childhood. A childhood shaped not by wealth, but by will. Not by ease, but by example. Dolores hadn't just raised a basketball player. She'd raised a man who understood what it meant to be more. And now, it was his turn to make sure her story, and the stories of every child who still walked the streets of Wilmington, wouldn't be forgotten. It was a memory Michael rarely talked about. Not in interviews, not in documentaries, not even with his closest friends. But it lived in him, as vivid and permanent as the scar on his knee from the time he fell trying to ride it too fast down the gravel hill behind their house. The red bike. It wasn't new. It wasn't sleek or shiny. But to a young Michael Jordan, it had been everything. He must have been around 8 years old when he first saw it. It had belonged to an older boy down the street, a kid who was about to move away. The bike was beat up, paint chipped around the frame, one handlebar wrapped in duct tape. But to Michael, it might as well have been a Corvette. He remembered standing there on the sidewalk, staring as the boy rode it up and down the block. The red bike moved like freedom, fast, fearless, and too far out of reach. Michael hadn't said anything at the time, just watched quietly. His fingers curled into the edge of his shirt like he was holding himself back. Dolores noticed. Of course she did. Later that night, as she washed dishes with the radio humming low in the background, she said casually, "You've got a birthday coming up." Michael perked up. "I know what I want." She turned off the faucet, wiping her hands on a towel. "Let me guess, the red bike?" He nodded. "I could do all my errands with it, get groceries faster, go to school without waiting for the bus." She smiled, because even then, he knew how to make an argument sound like a service. Dolores didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. That was how she worked. She let time and effort shape what happened next. For the next 3 months, Michael did every job he could find. He mowed lawns, carried groceries for neighbors, raked leaves, and even offered to sweep the floor at the corner store after school. Dolores never reminded him. She didn't have to. She just watched him, quietly proud, as he set his goal and chased it like it already belonged to him. He didn't raise enough money. Not quite. The bike had been priced at $35, and even with all his work, Michael came up short by $5. He still showed up at the boys' house on the last day before the move, clutching his envelope of crumpled bills and coins. "I'm sorry," Michael said, eyes downcast. "This is all I got." The boy shrugged. "Then I guess it's not yours." Michael turned to leave, fighting back tears. He didn't cry easily, not even then. But this stung. Not just because he wanted the bike, but because he had worked for it. Really worked. Dolores was waiting for him at home, folding laundry at the kitchen table, She didn't ask what happened. She didn't have to. She could see it in his face. He sat down silently. She walked over, opened her purse, and pulled out 5 crisp dollars. "Go back," she said. His head snapped up. "But you earned the rest of it, baby," she said, placing the bill in his hand. "That's what matters." Michael took the money and ran. That red bike became more than just a toy. It became his first taste of independence. He rode it everywhere, up and down the block, through puddles, to the library, to the grocery store. And when he wasn't riding it, he was cleaning it, fixing it, treating it like something sacred. Years later, when people asked him where his drive came from, he'd talk about competition, about losing and hating it, about wanting to be the best. But deep down, he knew it had started earlier than that. It had started with a red bike, a few dollars short, and a mother who saw just how badly he wanted something, and believed he had earned it. That story never made it into the highlight reels, but it was where the seed was planted. The belief that hard work mattered, that falling short didn't mean you'd failed, that someone would see your effort, even if the world didn't, and that sometimes the most important victories aren't handed to you. They're built, dollar by dollar, pedal by pedal, until you're riding into the future on wheels you earned yourself. Michael didn't keep that red bike forever, but the lesson, he carried that for life. It was a warm spring afternoon in Wilmington when the promise was made. Not out loud, not to anyone else, but in the quiet, stubborn place inside a boy's heart where dreams first take root. Michael was just 12, standing at the edge of his front yard with a basketball tucked under one arm, sweat on his forehead and dirt on his socks. He'd been out there for hours, practicing layups on the crooked rim his father had nailed to the side of the garage. The backboard was made from an old wooden pallet. The net? Long gone. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling. The way the ball fit in his hand like it belonged there. The way he could lose himself for hours, chasing perfection one missed shot at a time. The way the world, the loud world full of rules, noise, and doubt, faded away when it was just him and the hoop. That afternoon, Michael had just finished his 100th shot in a row when the screen door creaked open behind him. Dolores stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her voice as calm as it was commanding. "Homework before dinner, Michael." "Yes, ma'am," he said, already jogging toward the house. But as he stepped inside, he glanced back once more at the hoop, the ball, the sun dipping low behind the trees. He didn't know what the future held, not really. But something inside him had already decided it wasn't going to look like this. Not because he didn't love Wilmington. He did. He loved the smells of Sunday dinners, the feel of worn carpet under bare feet, the scratchy voice of the church choir warming up in the mornings. He loved the laughter of his brothers and the way his mother always hummed when she ironed his shirts. But he also saw the hard things. He saw how tired his father looked after a long shift, how Dolores clipped coupons and counted pennies, how his older neighbors spoke about life in terms of what wasn't possible. He heard the words that followed his name sometimes when adults didn't think he was listening. That boy's got a temper. That Jordan kid thinks too much of himself. But none of that mattered as much as the one thing that burned inside him, even when he didn't have the words for it. I want more. More than just getting by. More than just going to work, coming home, and starting over. He didn't want to live in the margins of someone else's story. He wanted to write his own. That night, after dinner and after homework, Michael lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the fan spinning slow circles above him. He listened to the hum of the house, his father's deep voice in another room, the creak of the hallway floorboards, the soft clink of dishes being put away. He made the promise then, in the stillness. One day, I'll give her everything. Everything she gave up. everything she never asked for. I'll make sure she never struggles again. I'll make her proud, and I won't stop until I do. It wasn't about money, not really. It was about worth, about proving, not just to others, but to himself, that he could rise, that he could turn pain into purpose, hunger into drive, silence into something that roared. That promise became a compass. Every time he lost a game, every time he was told he wasn't good enough, every time he felt overlooked, he'd return to it. That night in the dark, that quiet fire, Dolores never knew the full weight of it. She didn't know how often Michael would replay that moment in his mind, even as a grown man. When he was cut from the high school varsity team, when he sat on the bench at UNC, when the media said he'd never win without a team of superstars, he'd go back to the promise. He didn't need the world's permission to be great. He just needed a reason, and he had the best one. A woman who had given him everything with nothing, who believed in him before he ever believed in himself. That kind of belief doesn't fade. It builds you. And when a son makes a promise in the dark, long before the lights, the fans, and the fame, he carries it with him, always, especially when the world starts to listen. The small conference room inside the Wilmington Community Council building wasn't much to look at. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow on the linoleum floor. The air smelled faintly of old coffee and the plastic tang of copy paper. A long table, scratched and uneven, stretched down the center of the room. Folding chairs lined its sides. It was the kind of room where forgotten decisions were made, where well-meaning committees passed around budgets and forms, where voices were raised and then lowered, and where things often stalled before they ever started. But today, everything was different. Because Michael Jordan was in the room. No cameras, no entourage, just Michael, in a dark jacket and crisp white shirt, his expression focused, hands folded, eyes alert. If he had walked in with celebrity swagger, the room might have stiffened. But he didn't. He walked in like a man on a mission, not a superstar. And that made all the difference. The room had filled quickly. The city manager, a couple of council members, the head of the Parks and Recreation Department, a woman from the school board, 2 local pastors, and Dolores, sitting near the corner in her usual calm dignity, her hands resting lightly on her purse. She had organized the meeting. Quietly, of course. She didn't believe in making a fuss. But when Michael told her he wanted to do something big, something permanent, she had picked up the phone. Not to ask for favors, but to bring people to the table. Still, no one quite knew what to expect. Most of the officials had walked in with a kind of cautious curiosity. They knew Michael Jordan was a Wilmington native. They'd heard whispers, something about him wanting to invest in the community. But they'd seen celebrities make promises before. They'd seen ribbon cuttings and photo ops. They didn't want more headlines. They needed action. Michael waited until everyone had introduced themselves. He nodded at each name, shook hands where needed, said very little. When it was finally his turn to speak, he didn't raise his voice or stand. He simply leaned forward. "My mom told me about the library," he began, "about how it's closing, and about what it meant to this community." A few people exchanged glances. One man cleared his throat like he was about to interject, but Michael continued. "I grew up in that building. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. It was the first place where I felt like I could become something more than what people expected of me." He looked at the woman from the school board. "You know how many kids walk past that building every day and don't even know what's inside? They don't know what's been lost. They don't even know what's possible." The room was silent. Dolores sat still, watching her son with quiet pride, her eyes glistening just slightly. Not because he was famous, but because he had remembered, because he was telling the truth. "I don't want to just save the building," Michael said. "I want to rebuild it, Reimagine it. He laid a folder on the table. Inside were early renderings, clean, hopeful designs for what he wanted the place to become. A modern learning center, complete with books, technology labs, tutoring rooms, community kitchens, gardens, and safe spaces for teens to hang out after school. There was a space for the arts, a space for storytelling, a space for families. He pointed to a sketch. "This," he said, "isn't just a library. It's a launch pad." The city manager leaned forward. "And you'd fund it?" Michael nodded. "I'll cover every cent. Construction, maintenance, programming, staffing. But I don't want this to be Michael Jordan's building. I want it to belong to Wilmington. I want buy-in, not money, but partnership." A pastor near the end of the table spoke next, slowly. "You're not just donating, you're building something that lasts." Michael nodded again. "It's not about charity, it's about legacy." A murmur rippled around the table. Agreement, surprise, a spark of something that hadn't been felt in a long time. Momentum. Over the next hour, the conversation shifted from skepticism to possibility. People started tossing out ideas. A school board member offered to create literacy programs. A councilwoman said she'd bring in volunteers. Someone even mentioned transportation routes for kids who lived further out. Dolores said very little. But she didn't have to. Her son had taken the spark she lit in him as a boy and turned it into something real. Something far bigger than either of them could have imagined all those years ago in the basement or by the broken-down basketball hoop. The meeting ended with handshakes and real commitments. No empty promises, no vague intentions. Just a room full of people finally moving in the same direction. As the crowd thinned, Michael turned to his mother and whispered, "We're gonna build something beautiful, Mama." Dolores reached out and touched his arm. "You already are." The whispers started the very next morning. At first, it was just the regulars, the ones who always sat in the corner booths of the old diner on Market Street, sipping their coffee and talking about everything and nothing. "You hear who was at the council building yesterday?" one asked, stirring sugar into his cup like it was a secret ingredient. "Michael Jordan. The Michael Jordan." Another leaned in. "His mama brought him in. Something about the old library." By noon, the story had taken on a life of its own. At the beauty salon 2 blocks over, Ms. Clara had paused mid-perm to announce, "I heard they're tearing down the old community center and building a museum with his shoes in it." Her client, half wrapped in foil and disbelief, shook her head. "Nah, I heard it's a tech lab for athletes, like a sports academy or something." Meanwhile, at the local elementary school, a few teachers exchanged glances in the break room. "If this is true," one said, holding a plastic fork over her salad, "and he's actually funding something here, it changes everything." Another chimed in. "My students barely have working computers in the classroom. What if this place has laptops, robotics kits, real tutors?" Even the kids caught on. At recess, they whispered like it was urban legend. "My cousin said MJ is building a place where you can learn to fly drones," one boy said, eyes wide. "No, my uncle said it's going to be a gym with secret tunnels," another replied, as if Michael Jordan were Batman. No one had all the details, not yet. But in a town where dreams had long been trimmed to fit reality, even a whisper of hope was enough to stir people awake. Dolores, of course, heard it all. She heard it in the way the cashier at the grocery store looked at her differently, just a little longer, just a little warmer. She heard it in the phone calls from neighbors she hadn't spoken to in months, checking in under the thin excuse of "just wanted to say hi." And she heard it when she walked into the old library the next Wednesday, like she always did, and found more kids than usual waiting near the door. "We heard something's happening here," one little girl said, backpack nearly falling off her shoulders. "Is it true?" Dolores smiled and held open the door. "It is, but you're still the most important part of it." Inside, the old building seemed to sit up a little straighter, as if it too had heard the news. Sunlight poured through the dusty windows in golden streaks. The cracked linoleum floors didn't seem quite so worn, and even though the radiator still clicked and groaned like an old man clearing his throat, the space felt alive again. Later that week, an article ran in the Wilmington Chronicle. Just a short piece. No big photo, no sensational headline. Just a few paragraphs confirming that Michael Jordan had met with the city council and shared early plans to build a new learning and resource center where the library once stood. The article was factual, reserved. The people were anything but. On church steps and park benches, in barbershops and corner stores, the conversations grew louder. Some were skeptical. "We've heard promises before." Others were hopeful. "If it's Michael, maybe it's real." But mostly, it was pride that colored their voices. Pride that one of their own, someone who had walked the same sidewalks, breathed the same thick Carolina air, been shaped by the same small-town soil, was coming back not just to visit, but to build. Some people said it wasn't just a building anymore. It was a signal that Wilmington mattered, that the kids here still had something to reach for, that the stories their parents and grandparents told about the value of hard work and quiet faith weren't relics, they were roots. And those roots were now growing something brand new. Not everyone knew what to believe yet. That was okay. In places like Wilmington, belief took time. It had to pass from neighbor to neighbor, from one whispered hope to another. But the tide was shifting. And just like that, the whispers started to sound a little more like a promise, a future worth leaning into. Michael stood in the middle of the empty lot just before sunset, the sky above Wilmington turning the color of molten gold. The building that had once been the library had already been cleared. Walls brought down brick by brick, debris hauled away over the last few weeks. All that remained now was flat earth and a growing sense that something extraordinary was about to rise. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the wind brush past his face. He wasn't thinking about basketball, not about the championships or the records or the shoes with his name on them. He wasn't thinking about arenas or endorsements or the endless flash of cameras. Right now, none of that mattered. What mattered was what came next. Michael had spent his whole life competing. On the court, it was about being the best. No compromises, no shortcuts. It had shaped him, fueled him, made him who he was. But now, standing on the soil where his past had taken root, he realized he didn't want to just be the best anymore. He wanted to build something that outlasted him. The idea had been growing ever since his mother made that phone call. What started as a desire to restore an old library had grown into something larger, something wider and deeper than even he had expected. Because the more he thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't just about saving a building or putting up a shiny new structure in its place. It was about rewriting a blueprint, not for basketball, but for belief. For decades, people had told the story of Michael Jordan as a singular force, a once-in-a-generation athlete who beat the odds. But he knew better. He hadn't done it alone. There were teachers, coaches, neighbors, quiet mentors. And above all, there was his mother, who poured strength into him every single day in ways the world never saw. This center, what he now called the Flight Lab, wasn't going to be just another community center. It would be a living, breathing space where potential could take off. A place where kids could walk in with doubt and walk out with direction. Where someone would look them in the eye and say, "You matter. You're not invisible. You belong here." Michael imagined classrooms filled with books and tablets, spaces where young minds could design, write, code, and explore. He envisioned a mentorship wing, where local leaders could meet one-on-one with students, not just to offer advice, but to listen, to understand. He saw a studio where kids could record their own stories, podcasts, music, poetry, because every voice deserved a microphone. There would be a gym, of course. He'd be lying if he said otherwise. Basketball was still in his blood, but it wouldn't be the heart of the place. It would be just one part of a bigger system, a reminder that greatness comes in many forms. Not all of them wear jerseys. He'd even spoken to architects about using glass walls throughout the building, not just for aesthetics, but for transparency, for openness, for showing kids, literally and figuratively, that they had nothing to hide from and everything to reach for. This wasn't about charity. Michael never liked that word. Charity felt like a favor. This was about investment, not just his, but the community's. He wanted Wilmington to feel ownership, to walk through the doors not as guests, but as founders. He didn't want kids to grow up thinking success had to mean leaving. He wanted them to believe success could mean returning and building right where you started. Behind him, footsteps approached. It was Theo, his longtime assistant, holding a clipboard and phone, already talking through logistics. There were permits to finalize, teams to assemble, timelines to meet. Michael turned, listening, nodding, but his eyes drifted back to the horizon. "I don't want this to be just another ribbon cutting," he said, more to himself than to Theo. "I want it to be a revolution." Theo paused. "A revolution?" Michael nodded slowly. "Of how we see potential. Of how we raise our kids to believe in more than luck or escape. This," he gestured to the ground beneath them, "this is where it starts." He could already see it. Not just the walls and windows, but the faces, the possibilities, the shift. And in that moment, Michael Jordan, the legend, the icon, the competitor, wasn't thinking about his past at all. He was too focused on building a future. The first brick was laid on a Tuesday morning under a soft Carolina sun. Dolores stood a few feet back, sunglasses shielding her eyes, but not the emotion behind them. She watched as a small team of workers, local, just like she'd insisted, measured, leveled, and began what would become the cornerstone of something far bigger than a building. Michael wasn't there that morning, not because he didn't care, he cared deeply, but because he knew when to take the spotlight and when to let others step into it. This was her moment, the beginning of something she'd once only dared to imagine in hushed prayers and quiet Wednesdays spent reading to kids who didn't even know her name. The construction crew didn't just see concrete and rebar. They saw possibility. That's what the project had already become. A whisper turned movement, a blueprint turned symbol. It spread through Wilmington not with fanfare, but with purpose. Slowly, steadily. Everyone knew what it was becoming now, a place where every kid matters. That phrase began to appear on walls, on buttons, on t-shirts. It wasn't official, it wasn't marketing. It was organic, passed hand to hand like something sacred. No one needed to define it. Everyone already knew what it meant. It meant you didn't need to be the best basketball player in the world to be seen. You didn't need perfect grades, new clothes, or the right connections. You just needed to walk through the doors and be willing to dream. Michael's design team had taken that idea and built it into every inch of the space. The ceilings were high and open, not just architecturally, but symbolically. "We don't cap potential," he'd told them. "We build room for it to grow." The building would have no metal detectors, no cold gray security checkpoints that told you before you even stepped inside that you were being watched. Instead, there would be greeters, retired teachers, parents, volunteers from the community, ready to look every kid in the eye and say, "We're glad you're here." Because for so many kids, being seen was the first step to being saved. There'd be a reading room lined with beanbags and blankets, a place where stories could wrap around a childlike warmth. Nearby, a recording studio with soundproof walls and donated equipment, so kids who grew up with nothing but noise could finally find their voice. A kitchen would host nutrition classes for families. A digital lab would open the world of coding and design to teenagers who'd never touched a tablet more advanced than a school-issued Chromebook. And there would be tutors. Not just the academic kind, but life tutors. Mentors who knew what it was like to grow up dodging potholes both on the street and in the heart. And perhaps most revolutionary of all, there would be no fee, not $1. Michael had made it clear. They don't pay to matter. Dolores knew the names of most of the kids who would benefit. She had watched them grow up, watched their mothers juggle jobs and wipe noses and keep going. She had seen the boys who had talent but no place to show it, the girls who read quietly to avoid being noticed, the kids who lived with grandparents and carried invisible weights. These were not just children. They were flickering lights. And now, finally, someone has built them a place to shine. By the time the building's steel frame rose above the foundation, people had started coming by just to watch. Grandfathers with folding chairs, kids on bikes, teenagers who pretended not to care but lingered long after they should have gone home. Dolores came every morning, same time, same bench. She greeted the workers, handed out water bottles, and made sure the construction manager knew this place wasn't just a project, it was a promise. And as weeks passed, and walls went up, and lights were installed, Wilmington began to change. Not in ways you could always measure, but in the way people talked to each other, the way neighbors asked how they could help, the way teachers told their students, "When the center opens, I want you to go." And when the first "now hiring" signs were posted for mentors, counselors, workshop leaders, the line at the application table stretched around the block. Because people didn't just want a job, they wanted to be part of something that mattered. And in a town that had spent too long waiting for someone else to notice it, the message was finally clear. Every kid mattered. And now, there would be a place to prove it. The ground was red and raw, just like the clay Michael remembered from childhood. Stubborn, thick, and tough to dig through. The kind of soil that stuck to your sneakers and refused to let go. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't soft, but it was honest. And if you built something here, it meant you meant it. That's how he knew this project would last. Michael arrived on site just after dawn one morning, dressed in jeans and a black t-shirt, ball cap low over his eyes. No camera crew, no fanfare, just him, a cup of coffee, and the sound of construction equipment warming up in the background. The skeleton of the new building was already taking shape. Steel beams rising like ribs toward the sky, scaffolding laced around them like scaffolds in progress. It looked more like a work in progress than a promise. And that was perfect. Because that's what he'd always believed in. Progress. Hard work. Building something solid from the bottom, not starting at the top. The foreman noticed him standing there, nodded, and walked over. "You're early," he said, offering a respectful smile. "Most folks don't show up till after the foundation's poured." Michael nodded. "That's where the work starts, right?" The foreman chuckled. "Sure is." And for the next 2 hours, Michael didn't just watch, he helped. Nothing fancy, just carrying materials, steadying beams, talking to workers between tasks. He asked questions, listened closely, and thanked every man and woman on the crew. No press releases, no speeches, just respect, person to person. Because he remembered the men from his childhood, men like his father, who worked with their hands, whose backs ached before noon, whose sweat kept the lights on. And he knew that the soul of any building wasn't in its walls. It was in the people who raised them. Back in the city, some still called it Jordan Center. That was never the plan, and Michael had pushed back on it every time. "This isn't mine," he'd tell reporters. "It's Wilmington's. I'm just helping build it." And build it, he did. Every choice, from the layout of the rooms to the color of the walls, had intention behind it. Dolores helped select the art, pieces by local kids, portraits of historical figures who never made it into school textbooks, murals that reminded you who you were and who you could be. The team made sure the reading room had more than just books. It had soft places to sit, quiet corners to think, chairs big enough for parents and kids to read together. Because comfort mattered too. Not just survival, dignity, welcome, belonging. In the digital wing, Michael had insisted on state-of-the-art equipment, not because it was flashy, but because it said something. "You give kids second-hand tools," he told the design team, "and they'll believe they deserve second-hand futures." So there were 3D printers, animation software, music editing stations, and a mentorship wall, a giant touchscreen board where students could book time with volunteers in careers ranging from medicine to architecture to game design. People from all over the country had signed up. Some even moved to Wilmington to be part of it. The center would open in stages, with a soft launch planned for late summer. But already, something was changing in the neighborhood. You could feel it on the sidewalks, see it in the eyes of kids who rode past the site on their bikes, slowing just enough to dream. Parents started to talk about when, not if. Teachers began to weave the center into lesson plans. A few retired principals offered to volunteer. And through it all, Dolores kept showing up. Sometimes she brought cookies for the crew. Sometimes she just sat quietly in the shade, watching the walls rise, hands folded in her lap. She wasn't overseeing. She was remembering. The basement, the bike, the promise her son had once made in the quiet of his room. Now, he was keeping it. Not with words, with concrete, with wiring, with real, sacred space. Build from the ground up, she had always taught. Not just buildings, people. And for the first time in a long time, Wilmington wasn't just remembering its past. It was watching a future take shape. One beam, one book, one child at a time. The morning of the grand opening dawned quiet, the kind of gentle golden Carolina morning where the air smells like fresh-cut grass and possibility. Wilmington stirred slowly, as it always did, shop owners flipping signs from closed to open, neighbors walking dogs with coffee mugs in hand, church bells chiming in the distance like a memory. But something was different. There was a hum beneath it all, a vibration that wasn't quite noise, but wasn't silence either. People felt it in their bones before they ever saw it with their eyes. Because today was the day. The flight lab, what had begun as a whispered dream, then a cleared lot, then a steel skeleton under a hot sun, was finally ready. And though there had been no massive media blitz, no commercial spots or press conferences, the people knew. The city knew. Word of mouth had moved faster and stronger than any headline ever could. By 8 o'clock a.m., the line was already stretching down the block. Families, teachers, students in too big sneakers and backpacks that looked worn but hopeful. Elders leaning on canes and clutching the hands of grandchildren who had never seen the inside of a place built for them. Not just open to them, but made for them. There were no celebrity red carpets, no blaring music, no rented influencers taking selfies at the door. Just a crowd of real people in real clothes with real hope. Dolores arrived just before the doors opened. She stepped out of a simple black car, dressed in a soft gray dress and pearl earrings. Elegant, understated, entirely herself. When the crowd saw her, a spontaneous hush fell. Not because she demanded it, but because respect recognizes itself. Michael was already inside. He hadn't wanted to make a grand entrance. That wasn't the point. He stood just beyond the glass doors, next to the same foreman who had helped lay the first foundation beam, and the first librarian hired to run the youth section. He didn't want to be above the crowd. He wanted to be with it. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the doors opened. Not with confetti cannons or speeches, but with Dolores. She stepped forward, took the bronze handle in her hand, and pulled. "Come on in," she said, her voice soft but strong. And Wilmington walked through. What they found inside stopped them cold. The lobby was light and airy, sunlight flooding through high windows, walls lined with photos of Wilmington's history. Yes, the struggles, but also the victories. There were pictures of teachers, veterans, community leaders, and students who had gone on to do great things. Faces that looked like theirs. To the right, the literacy wing, designed like a bookstore you'd see in a glossy magazine, but warmer, cozier. Soft couches, reading nooks. Shelves full of books by authors who had grown up in neighborhoods just like theirs. Above the door in gold lettering, a quote from Dolores, "Let them read and let them rise." To the left, the tech lab. Kids gathered around glowing screens, eyes wide as mentors showed them how to code, design, build. For many, it was the first time touching a computer not from a school cart, but a top-tier workstation made for exploration, not testing. Upstairs, the mentorship lounge and wellness center. Soft music, journals on tables, adults who listened more than they talked. A space where teens could come not to be fixed, but to be heard. And in the back, a surprise no one expected. A gallery. A rotating exhibit space where local youth could display art, photography, poetry. On opening day, the walls were filled with pieces created by Wilmington students over the summer, each one framed and tagged with the artist's name, age, and school. People moved slowly through the space, some in awe, some in tears. This wasn't just a building. It was an answer. An answer to a question the city had been asking for decades. Do we matter? Yes. And not just because Michael Jordan said so, but because he showed them. He didn't stand at the center of the crowd that day. He stood off to the side, hand in his pocket, watching the faces. The kids pointing to their artwork, the parents wiping their eyes, the neighbors hugging each other like they'd just witnessed something holy. Dolores eventually found him, standing near the mentorship board where students could sign up for one-on-one time with engineers, chefs, pilots, doctors, people who had once been in their shoes. She touched his arm gently. "You did good, baby." He nodded. "You gave them something I never had," she said. Michael turned to her, eyes misty. "You gave me everything," he said. And as they stood there, mother and son, teacher and student, builder and blueprint, the first bell rang. Not for class, but for a new beginning. And this time, everyone got to walk through the front door. The auditorium was full, standing room only. Not because someone famous was scheduled to speak. Not because there was some fancy performance, but because word had spread. Quietly, earnestly, the way real things often do. Dolores Jordan was going to speak. They had saved the final spot in the program for her, right after the ribbon had been cut. After the first children had officially walked through the doors of the center with wide eyes and open hearts. Michael had spoken earlier, of course, briefly, humbly, as always when it came to this project. But everyone knew the moment the crowd was really waiting for. The woman who had lit the first match. The chairs were filled with people from every corner of Wilmington, teachers in worn cardigans, barbers in pressed polos, church elders with silver hair and strong hands, teens in their Sunday best, little ones sitting on parents' laps. Even the mayor stood at the back of the room without a podium, without a mic, just another face in the crowd. When Dolores stepped onto the stage, something happened. The noise softened, as if the very air understood that a presence had entered it. She walked slowly, not because of age, but because of grace. Every step was steady. Every step carried a memory. Every step belonged to the journey she had never asked for recognition on. She reached the podium and rested her hands on its edge. She didn't need notes. She didn't need a teleprompter. Her words were already written, in the chapters of her life, in the lives she had shaped, in the legacy now cemented in brick and glass behind her. For a moment she just looked out at the crowd. Then she smiled. "I want to thank you all for being here today," she said, her voice as calm and sure as ever. "This is not the kind of moment you plan for. It's the kind you pray for." The room fell into complete silence. I came to Wilmington many years ago with 3 things: a suitcase, a prayer, and 3 children who depended on me. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And we had dreams, small ones at first. But dreams, like children, grow up when you feed them. A quiet chuckle moved through the audience. "I remember when Michael was little," she continued. "He'd dribble that old basketball through the kitchen like he was on national television. I'd yell at him to take it outside, and he'd say, 'Mama, I'm practicing for the big game.' He said that before he could even spell the word practice." The laughter grew. "But do you know what mattered most to me?" she asked, her voice turning thoughtful. "It wasn't the game. It was that he believed it was possible, that something big was waiting for him. And he didn't learn that from a basketball. He learned that in the quiet, in the reading, in the places that told him he had value before the world did." She looked to the back of the room where Michael stood, hands folded, head slightly bowed. "We live in a world where too many children grow up without being told they matter," she said, her voice rising just slightly. "They're measured by how they look, by where they come from, by what they don't have. And over time, they start to believe those lies." Her eyes swept the crowd now, slowly, intentionally. "Well, this place, this center, is here to remind them of the truth. That they are seen, that they are enough, that they are not waiting to become somebody, they already are somebody." The room was still, not out of politeness, but out of reverence. Dolores took a breath, then continued. "We didn't build this so people would talk about us. We built it so children would talk about themselves, about their dreams, about their futures, about their worth. And when they walk through these doors, I hope they hear a voice, maybe mine, maybe yours, whispering, 'Welcome home.'" She paused, letting the words settle like morning dew. "And one more thing," she added gently. "Don't wait until you're famous to give back. Don't wait until you have extra. Give from wherever you are. Give with your time, your kindness, your presence, because someone once did that for me." She stepped back from the podium, the room rising to its feet not with applause, but with something more powerful: honor. Michael walked forward and wrapped his arms around her, and for a long moment they stood there in the light, mother and son, surrounded by the very community they had built this for. Dolores didn't need the spotlight. She was the light. And on that stage, she didn't just speak. She passed the torch. Years from now, people wouldn't remember every detail of the building, how tall the windows were, how many chairs were in the reading room, or what kind of wood trimmed the door frames. But they'd remember the feeling. The way it felt to walk into a place built on something deeper than funding or fame. Built on the quiet strength of a woman who never asked for recognition, only for opportunity. A mother's wish. That's how all of it started. Not with a grand idea or a press release, but with one woman picking up the phone and asking her son for something she had never asked before. Not for herself, not for glory, just for help. For her hometown. For the kids she'd seen walking by the boarded-up library with their heads down, their potential dimmed by years of being told they didn't matter. It would have been easy to look the other way, to say it wasn't her job anymore. After all, Dolores Jordan had done her part. She had raised her children, worked her jobs, lived her life with grace and humility. She had poured so much of herself into others that no one would have blamed her for simply resting now. But Dolores had never been one to rest when there was still work to do. She knew something the rest of the world often forgot. That change doesn't always start with movements or protests or million-dollar pledges. Sometimes it starts in the stillness, in the simple ache of a mother who wants more for everyone's children, not just her own. And somehow, in the same way she had once poured wisdom into Michael across the kitchen table, or whispered courage into him after his high school heartbreak, she poured it once more into a single request. "I need your help," she'd said. That sentence moved mountains, because it reminded Michael of where he came from, of who made him, of the dusty old books she used to read aloud by lamplight when the power bill hadn't been paid, of the way she taught him that greatness had less to do with talent and everything to do with how you treated people when no one was watching. So he didn't just donate money. He didn't just put his name on a building. He built a movement. A new kind of monument, not to himself, but to the values his mother had lived by every single day. The flight lab became more than a center. It became a ripple. Kids who had never left Wilmington were suddenly winning statewide robotics competitions. Teenagers who once cut class now spent afternoons learning to code, record music, build businesses. Girls who were told they were too quiet or too poor or too ordinary stood behind microphones, reading poems that left audiences breathless. And it wasn't just the kids. Parents got jobs, real ones. Retired teachers found purpose again. Community members became mentors. Volunteers from across the state signed up, not because they wanted to meet a celebrity, but because they wanted to be part of something real, something rooted. And always, somewhere in the background, was Dolores. Not standing in the spotlight, but standing beside someone in need, helping them find their place in the story. She never claimed the credit. She never wanted it. But you could see her fingerprints everywhere, in the way the greeters smiled, in the way the librarians knelt to meet a child's eyes, in the way every staff member was trained to say, "We're glad you're here," before they asked for an ID. People came from other cities, other states, asking how to replicate the model. Michael always answered the same way: "You start with someone who cares." That was the truth. The whole truth. This hadn't started because someone wanted to be famous. It started because a mother noticed something broken and refused to stay silent about it. She didn't yell. She didn't beg. She simply believed. In her son, in her city, in what was possible when love took the lead. And in doing so, Dolores Jordan changed thousands of lives. One child at a time. One open door at a time. One quiet wish that turned into something the world would never forget. The sun was beginning to set over Wilmington, casting long golden shadows across the brick walls of the flight lab. Inside, the hum of learning still echoed. Children laughing in the tech lab. The soft flip of pages in the reading room. The low rhythm of music being mixed in the studio by a teenager who, just a year ago, didn't believe he had a voice worth hearing. Outside, Dolores sat on her usual bench near the front door, a quiet smile on her face. She watched as a little girl in pink sneakers held the hand of her older brother, both clutching library cards like golden tickets. A retired school teacher waved from across the sidewalk, and a young mentor in scrubs headed inside after a long shift, still showing up, still giving back. Michael stood beside his mother, hands in his pockets, the same way he used to as a boy, after helping her carry groceries in. Only now, the groceries were dreams, and she was still teaching him how to carry them gently. "You see all this?" he asked softly. Dolores didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. She simply nodded, eyes full of peace. Michael looked up at the building, glass glowing, kids still moving inside like the lights would never dim. "This'll last," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Long after I'm gone." Dolores smiled. "That's what you've built," she said. "Not a legacy for yourself, a place where others can find theirs." And she was right, because in the end, it was never just about basketball, never just about fame or fortune or finishing first. It was about people, about dignity, about believing that greatness doesn't come from being better than others, but from lifting others higher. Michael Jordan had spent a lifetime climbing, but his greatest act was turning back to build the staircase. The flight lab became more than a center. It became a spark. Other cities followed. More mothers called. More children believed. And across the country, the ripple spread. Not because of one man's money, but because of one mother's wisdom. So if you ever find yourself in Wilmington, North Carolina, turn down the quiet street where the light never quite fades. Walk through the doors that were once closed and feel what it means to be seen. Ask someone what changed. They might say, Michael Jordan. But if you stay long enough, listen closely, and follow the path back to where it began, they'll tell you the truth. It all started with a mother who made a call, and a son who answered it. Thank you for watching. Now I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, hit that like button so it can reach someone else who needs a little hope today. Also, don't forget to check out the video appearing on your screen right now for another inspiring story that will brighten your day.